Hello everyone, and welcome back to Age of Noob. Today, I figured that I haven't touched on blacksmith upgrades before, and many new or novice players would benefit on when to research which technology. You should all know by now that blacksmith upgrades are a must, but just like everything else in Age of Empires, timing is king. So without further ado, let's take a closer look at the blacksmith. Let's start with a quick refresher for brand new players. Blacksmiths can be built in the feudal age and cost 150 wood. It is the building you use to upgrade the weapons and armor of your military units. Some civilizations can research more things in their blacksmiths, but I'll only cover the fundamental shared technologies across all civilizations in this video. Although I'm not a fan of the icons at all, there are 4 distinct types of upgrade paths: melee damage, ranged damage, melee armor, and ranged armor. As you can see, each type of upgrade has one in the feudal, castle, and imperial age. They also increase the value of their respective attributes by +1, so although a very uninspired game design in my opinion, it's at least very easy for newcomers to wrap their head around it. Basically, each technology progressively gets more expensive, but they all cost the same total resources per age, and again, increase the attribute by +1. So you may be wondering, if they all cost the same per age and all increase the attributes by the same +1, why does the order matter? Well, it has to do with 3 things that all tie together. The first is in-game pathing when taking melee engagements, the second is the discrepancy between the rate of taking versus dealing damage, and the third is Lanchester's laws. If you don't know what Lanchester's laws mean, check out tip 31 in my top 50 tips video, as I have already covered it in depth there. Okay, let's go over each one now. The reason why the damage technology between melee and ranged units are prioritized differently is simply due to the fact that ranged units can often deal damage in large groups on a single target without much downtime. It's actually very simple if you think of it this way. A group of 30 archers can focus down a single horseman, but 30 horsemen can't surround and constantly attack a single archer. That's because melee units have to attack, path again to catch up to the enemy unit, then attack again, and so on. And 2, there's a limited amount of physical space units can occupy to deal damage, and in typical melee formations, sometimes only 1 or 2 units can attack another at a given time. This leads us to the second point of the discrepancy between the rate of taking versus dealing damage. Just as you saw in the previous example, pathing and physical space limitations don't affect ranged units, which is why they often get more value out of the attack upgrades compared to melee units. On that same token, however, ranged units often have very low HP and die very quickly when caught out. Hence, the additional armor helps very little because the units don't have a high enough HP to take advantage of it. This time, the opposite is true for high HP units. A knight, for example, gets significantly more value out of his additional armor because he can tack significantly more arrows. And third, Lanchester's laws force players to dwindle enemy damage output as soon as possible. This means that, for the offender, you want to one-shot enemy units as fast as possible, whereas the defender wants to retain units for their damage output as long as possible as well. So one-shotting enemy units with archers is the priority here for the attacker, and tanking as many arrows as possible to ensure your units can fight for longer is the priority for the defender. Hopefully, these 3 main concepts helped you wrap your head around why we will prioritize certain upgrades over others depending on the game. So now that we've learned about the why, let's look into the when. Okay, for ranged units, you want to prioritize the ranged attack upgrades. As mentioned, ranged units have low HP and cannot make use of the additional armor as much as the others, and you want to be able to dwindle enemy unit numbers as quickly as possible. Hence, always get the ranged attack upgrades first before grabbing the armor for them. For melee units, it's a bit more complicated. Let's start with the armor. If you're up against any sort of ranged units, which in most cases you will be, then you should prioritize grabbing the ranged armor first. This also does apply for raiding units such as the horsemen, as arrow fire from the town centers and outposts are also mitigated. In some weird scenario in which your game has only been melee versus melee combat, then do pick up the melee armor first. Remember, although one of your units can only attack one enemy unit at a time, that same unit can be attacked by multiple enemy units. The longer you retain your numbers, the more heavily the engagement will tip in your favor. As you can see, the melee attack comes last. The difference between the melee attack and armor upgrades is a fine one, but ranged attack for your ranged units and ranged armor for your melee units almost always provide you more value. So, let's summarize. If you have ranged units, get the ranged attack upgrades first. If you have melee units, then get the ranged armor first. If you have a combination of ranged and melee units, then get the ranged attack first, then the ranged armor. In some weird melee versus melee only combat, you can prioritize melee armor instead. And finally, get the remaining upgrades to last. I also want to make a quick disclaimer in case it wasn't too clear. The priority I mentioned applies per age. Remember that these technologies get significantly more expensive each age, so don't get all 3 ranged attack upgrades back to back if you haven't picked up Feudal Age's armor upgrades. Of course, you should adjust your prioritization based on the enemy composition, but this is a good rule of thumb nevertheless. And finally, you can also pick up 2 other technologies in the Blacksmith. The first is Siege Engineering, which allows your melee units to construct siege towers and rams on the field. There's nothing much to be shared here. It's a relatively cheap technology that some build orders or strategies will have you pick it up, and is a useful tool to push forward with your army, especially after the buffs to the rams recently. The second is Military Academy, which increases the production speed of military units by 33%. Don't get fooled by the 33% by the way, as the technology practically lowers the training time by 25% instead. I don't like the way that it's worded, but regardless, it shaves off training time by a quarter. To conceptualize its effect, it will take roughly 4.5 minutes of constant night production from a single stable to quote-unquote pay off its resources by speeding up an equivalent amount of resources produced. Hence, the rule of thumb for this technology is also rather simple. As long as you're training constantly from at least 2 military buildings, then picking up Military Academy will ensure a quick payoff and impact on the game. Any earlier, and you'd rather invest those resources into building additional military buildings and units instead. Thank you for watching, everyone. I've decided that I want to cover more fundamental game knowledge these days so that you can share with your friends who are either novice or new to the game to bring them up to speed. As always, subscribing to the channel helps a lot, so thank you for your support. Be kind to one another, and see you all in the next one.